Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to our last but one day of our UFMG Summer School on Brazilian Studies. We're so glad to have you back for this delightful morning. And just a quick reminder, at 2 p.m., we'll also have the presence of Professor Miguel Nicoleles, a top-notch scientist, Brazilian scientist. And I think we're gonna enjoy his words on the brain machine, right? But for the time, for now, we are gonna be delighted by the words of Professor Bruno Reis, um, one of the best professors and one of the best assets UFMG has on this very tough topic, Brazilian politics. And I am absolutely sure you will enjoy every one of his words. Please, Professor Bruno, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Luciana, for your kind words. Thank you all, guys, for watching, for being here, for accepting our invitation to follow our summer seminar on Brazilian studies. And well, I have a presentation on Brazilian politics, and I'll keep myself focused on kind of a description of how it works, kind of a diagnosis. And I hope to be able to let good ground for us to talk a bit after the presentation. So let me share a screen here. Yes, presentation. It's okay. Are you seeing it?
Yes, Professor. Perfect.
Okay. It's working, all right? Well, let me just leave the full screen mode. I hate it. But okay. This is, you see, Brazilian politics. My name is Bruno Reis. I'm from the Political Science Department at UFMG. And well, I start with a brief chronology of Brazilian political history. We are independent for nearly 2 centuries. Next year, we'll be celebrating our bicentennial. And we were at first a constitutional monarchy, the only American country that was monarchical for a good period, for 77 years, and a parliamentary regime. Then we were also one of not only the last monarchy in the hemisphere, but we were also one of the last slavist countries in the world. So we had slavery abolition only by the end of 19th century, 1888. And just a year later, not by coincidence, we had our first military coup. We had the end of the monarchy was overthrown and the republic was proclaimed. It was kind of a disaffection by certain elites with the abolition. And so the two events are quite correlated. At first, we have as was the standard by the time, we have a pretty oligarchic, non-competitive republic that lasted until 1930, as so many political regimes around the globe. And then we had a 15-year tenure by Getúlio Vargas, at first as a provisional government after the overthrow of the oligarchic republic until 34. Then we had a new constitution by 1934. But in 1937, a year before elections were due, he staged a coup by the end of 37 and stayed as the dictator until 45. After the war, he was overthrown. And then we had at last our first democratic experience that lasted less than 20 years until 1964, when they had a military coup again, and then a military dictatorship. And that lasted for a little more than 20 years. And then from 85, we have a restoration of a civilian government. And since 88, we have a new constitution. Okay. Well, there's a kind of little bit of numbers of statistics, at least by the beginning. First in 1993, that is just the year before Fernando Henrique Cardoso took office, in 1995 actually. But before the stabilization of the economy, we had an experience of high inflation. As you can see, about 2,000% a year in 1993, since mid-80s at the transition. And then in 1994, we had a kind of a stabilization. So I have some comparison that we can make here. 7 constitutions in 2 centuries. By early 90s, we have high inflation, high inequality, 10 finance ministers and 11 central bank presidents in 9 years. We had a high number of effective parties, about 8 at that point. And until then, only one democratically elected civilian president had finished his term. That was Juscelino Kubitschek in late 50s. So then, in the last 20 years, things looked pretty better until roughly 2013 and 2014. And so we had still the same constitution. The annual inflation mean dropped significantly, and it stayed in 1-digit indexes for the whole period, an annual mean of 7%. The Gini was dropping in an important way from 0.5. Now, unfortunately, not quite unfortunately, but catastrophically, we had a Gini in 2019 and 2021. Sorry, this is not actually 19. I updated it yesterday, but this number is for 2021. And this 0.654 is higher. Then our inequality is now higher than the inflationary period. I have the US Gini just for comparison. And you have a bigger stability at the economic administration and economic policy, with only 8 finance ministers for 25 years, quarter of a century, and only 8 central bank presidents, only 4 central bank presidents by this century. But our Laxo Tagapera effective number of parties index kept growing. In 2015, it had moved from roughly 9 to 13, and at the actual legislature since 2019, we have 16 effective parties and 30 actual parties in our lowest chamber. Is the highest in the world, most likely. We had only 3 presidents at the period from 95 until 2016, all re-elected. At least the first two, Fernando Henrique and Lula, have finished the 2 terms. It's quite an accomplishment for Brazilian political standards. Then Dilma Rousseff faced impeachment, and her vice president was succeeded by Jair Bolsonaro, bully, kind of a predator that took over, taking advantage of a serious crisis. But let's proceed. So Brazil is not only a multi-party presidential system with record number of parties, but also it has proportional representation with unordered lists. We can discuss this during our conversation. So we don't vote in parties. We vote in individual candidates. We have hundreds of individual candidates for each state at its election. So we have hundreds, in some cases thousands of individual candidacies that are running for money and for votes during our campaigns. We have a bicameral House of Senate, legislative branch, and a federal regime with 27 states, thousands of municipalities. The most striking characteristic of Brazilian politics, lots of parties have legislative chambers, both nationally and locally. National Congress, lower chamber, 500 seats. In last elections, we had 30 parties granted representation at the lower chamber. The biggest one has less than 11% of the chamber, the Workers' Party. The USA that I will use for comparative purpose here, USA is an extreme opposite, not desirable in itself, a duopoly, a stronghold of the same two parties for 150 years. 30 parties is bad. A multi-secular duopoly is bad too, but we are in those kind of polar positions in that comparison. The main reason for that is the electoral system, not sufficient by itself, but a necessary condition. Well, history shapes party systems, of course, but decisively electoral rules. The so-called Duverger law is very well known. Single-member districts decrease the number of parties. Proportional representations increases the number of parties, all else being equal. In our case, what we have of peculiar traits, we have single districts at state level. So in big states, there are a lot of seats. São Paulo has 70 representatives at the lower chamber, federal. Minas Gerais, that is my state, our state, have some 53 deputies. So high number of seats in many districts, low share of votes is required for winning a seat. We have individual candidacies, an open, unordered party lists. Everyone campaign for himself or herself. So, and at last, coalitions of parties could until recently, until our last elections, not anymore, not for the next, but they could run as a single list and disband after elections. So you have we'll have parties that wouldn't reach even the low share of votes required for winning a seat, but they were part of a coalition that reached that minimum. And then after the election, they just act by themselves. And so you have parties inside the chamber that don't have even the minimum share of votes, but they are there. So we have we have an electoral system that favors very strongly a strong fragmentation of the chambers. So here, so we have a kind of our regime has been branded in the last couple of decades as a coalition of presidentialism. That is pretty much just a case of multi-party presidentialism. If you're a multi-party regime, you will need coalitions to govern. So our former orthodoxy until 90s, Scott Mainwaring is a good and apt example that coalitional presidentialisms or presidentialist regimes shouldn't work well under multi-party systems. So besides theoretical reasons, he had a lot of very good empirical evidence to be cautious about them. 31 democracies existed at that time with more than a quarter century then, and only 4 of them were presidential regimes. None of them with multi-party systems. So in 1993, you had no presidentialist regime working with multi-party systems for more than 25 years. Only one historical precedent, that was Chile, from the 30s until 1973. That is a case that staged a horrible ending, lots of killings, mass killings and torture, and an extremely violent coup. So, good reasons to worry about coalitional presidentialism. Since then, though, lots of multi-party presidential regimes emerged in Eastern Europe. Okay, they are semi-presidential, but several African countries, Latin America, most typically, and among all, the Brazilian case became very well known. And it was until recently established as a relatively successful case. Let's see. Some core analytical propositions to understand the case here to enable some kind of diagnosis. A question brought by American political scientist of Greek origins, George Sibelius, veto players in 2002. It focuses on the concentration dispersion of veto power, working. That's a point relevant also for Adam Liebhardt, a Dutch political scientist from the 80s, that it was also in his own way working on the concentration dispersion of veto power. Well, the point that I want to stress here that more than coherence, a good constitution, more than you shouldn't look in a constitution for coherence in the sense of, oh, this is a constitution that wants to disperse veto power, or this is a constitution that wants to concentrate power. An institutional system, more than coherence in this kind of dogmatical sense, should likely look for balance, a decision system in which some traits aptly compensate others. It's a more fruitful approach. Under such a framework, every system should be precisely the opposite of a consistent of typical model. It should blend, they should be a good mix of institutions that concentrate power with others that disperse it, in order to reach some balance that you concentrate power in order to be able to make a decision, and to disperse power in order to be able to expect accomplishment and agreement on what you're doing. So, if a decision system taken as a whole should seek an appropriate balance between majoritarian in the Liebhardt language with concentrated veto powers and consociational dispersed veto powers traits, then one could analyze the Brazilian case as a system that compensates extreme dispersion of power at the electoral system with a quite powerful presidency. Sugar to Carry in 1992 made exactly the same point about how Brazilian presidency was able to streamline political process under multi-party presidentialism. Brazilian presidents have exceptional agenda power. They can initiate constitutional amendments, for example. They have exceptional collection of prerogatives on budgetary matters, has a strong degree of authority. The legislative process is pretty much concentrated and centralized even inside the chambers. So you have a floor that is very dispersed, but the table, the presidency is power even inside the legislative. You have some pretty much relaxed majorities for amending the constitution, 60% requirement. And on the other side, so Brazilian case depicted the most power presidency of democratic world and their expression. Sugar to Carry wrote that very phrase in 1992, still the time of instability and high inflation under Fernando Collor and Itamar Franco. So I would like here to make some explicit comparison with the United States, because I think that both countries give opposite solutions to this very same problem. The US is a case of a strictly majoritarian electoral system that favors that, you see, unmovable duopoly among Democrats and Republicans, that is compensated by strong mutual checks among different branches of government. The American presidency is a relatively weak presidency, internationally speaking. In Brazil, it's by the opposite, is a permissive open list proportional electoral system with many components that favors decentralization that is compensated by a strong concentration of prerogatives on the executive branch. Mainstream Brazilian political science since then, in the last couple of decades, in fact, used to explain recent Brazilian government's relative success until 2013 by this very concentration of prerogatives in the president's hands. But you know, there's a lot of responsibility on the president's hands, and you have to rely on an apt president. So given a bit of context, since the 60s, the country went through radical changes, mostly under military regime. It was a pretty much hardcore, modernizing, authoritarian regime that presided over sheer urbanization, pretty much chaotical, actually. But at the end, during the 80s, during transition, we have a vibrant urban society with a proliferation of organization of civil society, as well as a fresh collection of social movements that mainly under the Workers' Party, the PT, was the main beneficiary of this effervescence. So under their umbrella, those organizations, those movements found their way toward a stake of real influence on the political system. Subsidiary, not the upper hand, but they were participants. They still are. But you know, unions are losing leverage all over the globe. And here's not different. But in the 80s, it was still an incipient process. You have, so as you urbanize and industrialize and modernize, so to speak, you got a more complex, it favors a more complex institutional environment. We can remind here Robert Dahl polyarchy argument about as economy and society becomes more complex, so you should expect that the political system becomes more complex, more polyarchical too. So you had a process during the last decades of institutional differentiation and specialization, and that gave way to what some authors call the web of accountability. Control organizations, whistleblowers, autonomous institutions. So in the beginnings of last decade, this was a hot spot in our literature. Until recently, things used to look pretty good. So, hidden variable, campaign finance. It's a problem pretty much everywhere. It's very important. It's crucial to the connection between formal political institutions and society at large, and the drain through which political economic elites may exert a special influence over politics. So, and this was an Achilles heel, a vulnerability, an important vulnerability in our case. And here in Brazil, we have a unique ceiling on donations that is proportional to donors' income. So, and too many individual candidacies, open list PR with large districts. So donors had the upper hand in this market during the last decades. So as every one of us, and so until 2015, even corporations could donate proportionally to their gross income. So you have the asymmetries and the difference, the inequalities from markets being transplanted entirely to the electoral arena because big shots could donate millions legally. So since 2014, even legal donations began to be prosecuted. We have an enterprise, JBS, that was an exporter for protein products, meat, and they by themselves alone, they gave 300 million reais in donations, in electoral donations. They were responsible alone for 10% of all donations in 2014 elections. And then you had some criminal prosecution of allegations of corruption, and even legal donations began to be prosecuted, charged as active corruption. So in 2015, Supreme Court banned corporate donation as unconstitutional, and Congress responded with the creation of billionaire public electoral funds. In so doing, they created a new publicly funded system still in its beginnings. It doesn't produce many effects. So we had only one election under this regime at this point, one national election in 2018. And it's hard to tell you, you can tell with you're pretty much sure that, hidden money had increased, but we're still trying to have a grasp on how things are working in this new environment. So this is this is unfinished, the last point here, but the point is minorities are at this very moment rushing after the electoral administration for administrative criteria for allocation of funds. So as different parties have rights over different fractions of these funds, minorities, not only minorities, but underprivileged groups as women, Black, indigenous people, um, um, LGBTs, and people with deficiencies, whatever, they are going after the constitutional provision of equality, and then forcing courts to oblige political parties to have some kind of minimum share for all these groups. So this it promises to be an interesting experiment, but it's still in its beginning. So recent crisis, what happened? That it all collapsed so formidably. Economically, we had, yes, the end of China-induced easy growth period with high prices, with a commodities boom of the first decade of the century that benefited Lula's term. And President Dilma Rousseff's, in the beginnings of last decade, had a very slow reaction to it, to put it mildly. That took her entire first term. So you had a deteriorating economic environment in the first years of last decade. That, this kind of circumstance induces frustration and anger and bitterness. Politically, we witnessed a spectacular clash between the accountability web that I described before and established electoral practices favored by the electoral system in its campaign financing rules. So you had controlled organizations that were going after the cleaning of society, the moralization of everything, and a kind of an authoritarian, self-confident, self-righteous approach with that clashed and crashed spectacularly with a political system that was, that had incentives to go after big donors because of our peculiar ceiling that was proportional to the gross income of the donor. So this was fantastically destructive. So we had a bad interaction among campaign finance rules and electoral system. How do those things interact? It's not easy to walk here. We had no established theory on this interaction worldwide. no available typology of campaign finance systems to do easy comparisons. But think of a market of electoral money. It's the thing that I was asking people to do. The case of Brazil concentrated the supply of money with our ceiling that was proportional to the gross income of the donor. If you can give more money being rich enough, so if I'm a rational politician, I will knock the door of very rich people. This is the one hand. So this concentrated the supply of money. And we had a dispersion of the demand for money in our electoral system with thousands or hundreds of individual candidates for the lower chamber going after the funding of their own individual campaign. So we had a market for campaign finance that gave the upper hand, gave power to the donors, to a very few, very powerful donors. It makes a kind of a corrupted system, but it's corruption in a kind of a philosophical sense. It's not easy to translate it in a technical, legal way, a charge on corruption. So as corruption is a crime that necessarily involves public agents' misconduct, a war on corruption that was unleashed used to be very easily perceived, and was the case. It was clearly perceived as a fight against the state, against the political system, against the politicians, and very clearly against established political parties. What's the problem? A strong state machinery is exactly what we need to want to keep corruption checked. But we disorganized our political system and so we displaced the routines that were taking place. We need robust routines to fight against corruption, reciprocal checks and balances, checks among agents and controllers. And an organized party competition is very important, where rival parties keep their eyes open over one another. And all these were very destabilized in the last decade. And we were very clearly in a much worse position to check corruption at this point. As we see in the Brazilian case, party competition, the structured party competition cannot be taken for granted. And an institutionalized party system might take several decades in the making. We had I didn't put it written here, but we had from 1994 through 98, 2002, 2006, 2010, 2014, we had 6 presidential elections that were polarized among the same 2 parties, the PT, the Workers' Party, and the PSDB, that was the party of the President Fernando Henrique Cardoso. So this could have been the beginning of a kind of a consolidated, institutionalized party system among those gravitating around those 2 poles. But I believe that the electoral system worked against it. And when the regime were destabilized by a crisis, economic and political crisis, the party system was pretty much devastated. The Workers' Party remains relevant. It is the biggest party at the chamber now, but only with just 11% of the seats. And PSDB was severely impacted and is smaller than many others. A point that I want to stress, I used to stress recently, that we should be aware that every time corruption looks systemic, plaguing large chunks of political process, in our case, the electoral process was the case of Brazil, my bet is that we face serious regulatory deficiencies, as I think it was the case in Brazil. That's not to minimize the problem. By the contrary, a regulatory problem may be more serious if you have the wrong rules, may be more difficult to solve than if you have bad guys around. If you have just crime, you just prosecute the suspects and you'll be improving. But you have bad regulatory framework, then you may put in jail the whole community of politicians and things only get worse. In a sense, more than theft, asymmetrical legal influence over politics may be worse, it will be harder to eradicate. If you have the upper hand in writing the law as an influencer in elections, have a big donor, why would you bother to break it? So it's not the point of prosecuting everyone and then you have a clean political system. The problem is to have not only have rules, but good rules. It's not trivial to establish which rules would be good or not. Fight against corruption is public duty, of course, and it's clearly welcome as long as it is itself strictly legal, conducted under the established constitutional framing. Its success requires good administration and bureaucracy, and circumspection and self-restraint by prosecutors. Brazil was building a pretty impressive accountability web, most of all along the last couple of decades, but that web remained itself largely unchecked. Perhaps the irony that was perhaps the Workers' Party worst legacy, a mix of arrogance and naivety. The party might well have weakened public controls over controllers, just promoting, enabling the association of legal, of national federal attorneys to elect literally the Attorney General. So at this point, now, the last few years, Brazilian political system pretty much falls adrift, prey to a predator. That happened to seem weird enough to attract loads of people really angry by years of sensationalist media coverage of political corruption. And then came the pandemic. So as we were in the middle of a kind of the bottom of the pit, and we were just struggling to try to see a couple of years in advance to see how much damage Bolsonaro would be able to inflict or not before he vanished to irrelevance again. And we were hoping to everything just to pass as quickly as possible. Then we were struck by a pandemic with the most inept government that we could, and any one of you could ever imagine. So it's a serious catastrophe. We have kind of 500,000 deaths, but in a conservative estimation, most certainly underestimated. We will end all this agony with less than 1 million deaths. So Bolsonaro is, yes, on the defensive, is enfeebled. It's pretty much likely that the pandemic will close any perspective of survival of Bolsonaro, but he's the president. He has no commitment to the institutional status quo. He will try to destabilize the electoral process of the next year. So we have all kinds of concerns and uncertainties about the near future. But probably his heyday has already passed, and it was not that beautiful, and he was never that popular. But at this point, we are at the bottom of a mishandled political situation, a political crisis of 10 years ago. We didn't know as a society how to cope with changing economic environment, and we behaved pretty much irresponsibly and made way to the unthinkable in many ways. Now, we'll probably, I'd like to think, and I think I have some reasons to believe that we will reach the bottom of the pit and we'll start going from bad to less bad for the next few years. But the remnants and the legacy of the passage of Bolsonaro through power, even if it is a brief passage, will stay with us for decades. So we have a legitimation of some kind of political brutality that will follow us for many decades. So at this point, the main concern, the main focus is how to conserve what we still have and how to build over it. Well, that's it. Thank you a lot. And I'm eager to respond to any doubts or questions,
Professor, thank you so
complaints.
much. Thank you so much for your words. I mean, I'm sorry about your words, right? But thank you very much for the insightful presentation. I love your optimism that we're going from worse to less bad. If that's a construction. But we'll get started. Usually that's how it goes. We'll sweeten up a little bit. We already have some questions, and so let's go for the first one, and then maybe we can unite and block some of the questions. But the first one is about the electronic voting. Isabella from UFMG. Recently, Bolsonaro has been pointing that electronic voting is not a fair way to the election. Is there a real chance that he approves the change from electronic voting to ballot voting? What would be the consequences of a change like that in Brazilian elections?
Can I go ahead?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I think that we shouldn't blink on it. If the institutions just admit to move on the defensive, to be put on the defensive on this matter, they will never be able to get on the offensive again for a good time. We have a pretty safe electoral counting system. Safe, fast, reliable. This is not our problem, definitely. So a lot of colleagues from computing science are skeptical about our machines. But what they miss is that the safety of the system is not dependent upon an invulnerable machine. No machine is invulnerable. They should know well. And every machine that realistically a national system could put in place would be worse than any theoretical alternative you can imagine. The safety of the counting of the votes in Brazil is dependent on the procedures and the institutionalized procedures by which the machines are used. And they are, yes, pretty much safe indeed. They are, in comparative terms and in realistic terms, they are perfectly safe. So this is not our problem. We have 30 years, 25 years or so using exclusively those machines, and the political elite doesn't have really concerns about it. You don't have a quest and a fight on counting ballots in Brazil for decades. And so you have Aécio Neves protested against 2014 results when he lost by a bit to Dilma Rousseff. But he was caught later on, 3 years later, in a tape admitting that it was just to irritate PT that it was kind of irresponsible act. He never believed he was stolen. And Bolsonaro is Bolsonaro. He's just playing for fun. Think about Trump. It's the same. It's just inventing anything to just, he doesn't care about elections. He doesn't give a damn. He's just playing on the destabilization and the dissemination of confusion, trying to take advantage. He will not win election next year. Okay, I have been wrong about Bolsonaro before, so I may be wrong this time again. But at this point, I think he was never the favorite to win re-election. I think the stabbing he suffered in September 2018 was probably very relevant for his victory. And it's hard to know what could have been taking place in that campaign if it was not for this event. And it's uncertain that he would be in the second round. And I never believed he was a favorite for re-election after the pandemic. At the point where we are right now, he's really, really in bad position. So it's uncertain if he finished his term. He's likely to finish his term, but it's not certain at all. So he's not a kind of a big populist leader that may be able to move the masses around him. It's not the case, but still he can do a beautiful amount of damage. And he's not neutralized at all. He's the president. So
any chance of him being impeached? Because for much less, other people, other presidents were impeached, like Dilma, for example. So we have, I mean, many things against him. Do you think
I will respond if the question is about any chance. So the answer is yes, there is some chance. If it is likely, I tend to believe it's not likely. But yes, it is possible. It may happen. Everything
in Brazil, right?
Bolsonaro, you can't discard anything. He's not a typical politician. He's not normal. I used to say, I refuse to normalize Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro is just not another politician that legitimately won elections, and so he has the right to implement his program. No, he's a saboteur. He's a predator. So he has to be contained. And his behavior on the pandemics is criminal since the beginning, independent of corruption and the acquisition of vaccines, and independent of parliamentary commissions of investigation. His conduct, his behavior is criminal since the first week of the pandemic, when he went on TV just to dismiss the importance of it. He laid ground to be impeached on the next day, that night, March 25, 2020. But, this is not enough. And you have to have 2/3 of the chamber against him. So it's not trivial to remove a president.
Okay, Marcos, you have a question for us?
Yes, the next question is from Stephanie Paliza. She's from Universidad San Ignacio de Loyola in Peru. And her question is, in the case of Peru, because of a history of guerrillas and terrorism, the left parties are weak and highly criticized by the media and majority of the public. Can it be said the same in the case of Brazil for the right parties because of the military coups and dictatorship?
That's a very good question. And in the case of Brazil, no. That's the answer. You can't really legitimate to complain about that. We had guerrillas, not quite terrorism. The terrorists events that took place in late 60s and early 70s were most of them staged by the military themselves, just to incriminate the left organizations. And you had guerrillas, yes, in a very small scale thing of just students, you know, fantasizing about replicating Cuba and things like that, all that romantic naivety that plagues, that were instrumentalized by small groups to co-opt students. And it was crushed by the military dictatorship in the early 70s. There, you know, it wasn't with no big effort, no big effort, and they were just a few hundred. So that's the point. When you go to the numbers, the military dictatorship in Brazil looks mild compared to Argentinian and Chilean, because this is a symptom of the scale of the resistance. So it was very localized. They were guerrillas pretty much with no money, unarmed, and very, very small penetration in the army, as a notorious case with Carlos Lamarca. You can count on your fingers of your hand the number of officers that were committed to guerrillas and to leftism. So since the transition, since early 80s, since 1980, the Workers' Party became an umbrella for those groups too. So it is widely recognized by the political science. A veteran political scientist, Cândido Mendes, 30 years ago, was writing about how the PT was a stabilizing force, not only by bringing unions and civil society to political system, to political party system, but also for bringing radicalized groups that, having been dragged to electoral landscape, they were domesticated. They were, you know, they were just they adopt some, you know, there are lots of leftists complain on the PT for that. There are a lot of leftists, a small leftist group that blame PT for conservatism and pragmatism and things like that. The point is, PT very rapidly adopted a kind of social democrat, not confessed, but yes, in practice, social democrat approach. It's very similar to the case of Southern European social democrat parties, socialist and laborist parties, because they have an organic link to unions, and they competed realistically for power, and they won, former union leaders won state governorships, were mayor of cities, they were deputies, they were senators, and then one of them became president. This is a kind of a legitimation, institutional, an institutional legitimacy for the, you know, you bring a whole lot of civil society to legitimize the political system. We had no precedent on it. And then once there, PT was very conservative and pragmatic in economic policy, under Lula, at least. Dilma took some bold measures, accepted some risks, and they didn't pay it. Bad decisions, catastrophic results. But the problem was much less a problem of, you know, some conservative organization being insecure about some eventual rebellion, but much more bad political economy managing and bad political articulation. You know, unfortunately, Dilma Rousseff was a new politician. She never run for office before. And I always say, for politics, use politician, please. We need politicians. They are professionals on their jobs. And Dilma Rousseff was not one of them. And we paid a a huge price for that. And this is, so the main sin of Rousseff's term is isolation. At the end, she was isolated from the legislative, she was isolated from business, she was isolated from unions, she was isolated from military, she was isolated from everyone. So she fell. So this is we had a bad managing economically and bad managing the political realm. So we had a bad president. But you know, bad president is not that rare. So it's pretty common. And I insist that our institutional framework was vulnerable. This is the point. And but the you know, as a the idea that, you know, those leftists, and so they allow for legitimate concerns about revolution intentions. So it's really made
Professor,
up. So
making
yes, Christian.
a link to what you have just said, because, I mean, from your words, I could assume that Dilma was not impeached because she was corrupt, but because she was isolated. So do you think we still live in Brazil? What kind of presidentialism is that the Congress can put people in office and out of office at their will? Isn't that a weird kind of presidentialism?
Well, how to avoid this? and the last, you know, in the end, what counts is power. Are you able to resist? There will be always people interested in removing you from power. The problem is if you know how to grab on it. And it's always the case. You know, it's kind of an awkward feature of presidentialism that the president is only removable by when criminal impeach. So it's a problem. We can see Trump, you know, as they have only two parties, and his party had enough votes to block impeachment. He avoided impeachment, independent of the many manifest crimes. So in the other, here we had again the opposite extreme. We had a president that, differently from Trump, was weak enough to be removed, and she was removed independently of the fact that she was not a criminal. So this is formal part of the accusation. Not even the impeachers alleged that she was corrupt. Yes, they framed as a crime of responsibility some budgetary maneuvering that was unorthodox, but was not uncommon. So it was used in a larger scale on those years, but you see, it's just administrative business. But she was weak enough to be impeached on this ground.
All right. So thank you very much again for your answer. We're going to change the subject a little bit for financing, for campaign financing. Juliana from UC Davis, California. What was the rationale for accepting billionaire contributions but not corporate ones? Could one not argue that billionaire political priorities are very similar to corporate ones?
Thank you, Juliana. It has been my point for all these years, since 2015, when the Supreme Court just ruled out corporations, but not private donors. Well, the Supreme Court didn't, didn't remove the ceiling that was proportional to gross income for private donors, for people, for physical billionaires, let's say. So we have still the same problem, because now you go after the owners of the corporations. So, but still, as corporate donors were banned, in fact, you had an impact on the ability, concrete ability of big shots to mobilize big money to that end. So despite the fact that you still have a problem that you have the political elite going after rich people. In fact, you can't raise, 3 billion reais anymore this way. So that's the reason why in 2014, just to give a figure, 75% of the money, private money raised, came from corporations. So from this point, 1 year after, it was unconstitutional for the donors of those 75% of the money to give again. So what the Congress made immediately, they established the public funds with billion figures. So it changed the landscape. It changed it in a way nobody was foreseeing. Surely not the Supreme Court. But they was just go, oh, there's lots of money, so that let's do something with no diagnosis. But they did. And then they unleashed the process that it's still beginning. There's an adaptation of the whole political landscape to this new situation that is a mainly publicly funded system. There are some problems for it because the inertia of the system is bigger because the same big parties have to receive the bigger chunk of money, etc. But what nobody foresaw was the movement from minorities going after the electoral justice, claiming the right to have a share of this share. No, independent of the party, they should give, say, 30% to women candidacies. And then, don't know, 20%, 25% to blacks, or to disabled people, or LGBT. And they are likely winning this share. They will probably, if nothing happens, I would bet that they will win. And this will be maybe a significant transformation of the landscape on the ground, even though big shots continue to self-finance themselves. And so billionaires and millionaire candidates became more frequent from 2016 now until now. But they will be rapidly on the company of more women, more black people, more indigenous people, more homosexuals and transsexuals, and all. It's kind of a weird development and an interesting one, and perhaps a promising one. I don't know.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. Mark, did you have a question for us?
Thank you, Professor. So the next question is from Lara Proes. She's from Queen Mary University of London, the UK. And her question is, do you believe that state investment on education, particularly on subjects such as economics and politics, could change the political scenario in Brazilian politics?
Mm-hmm. I believe yes, in terms that yes, investment in education change the landscape of any society. Kind of productivity, and also in political matters at a bigger share of the population is college educated and a more ambitious view, and it took place all over the world, kind of a process like that. I don't believe that specifically education and humanities and economics and politics would realistically be able to qualify the approach, the whole political dynamic in the society. I have some pretty much conservative colleagues, and you have, and American case is a good illustration. You have a very powerful collection of conservative think tanks that is very, very, very well educated, very well trained. So I used to see that the waters goes to the sea. Um, if your bias is to change things, so if you have some kind of leftist inclination, we have to assume from the start that you're going against the winds, against the natural order of things. The normal way of politics to develop is to stabilize status quo and to endorse the claims and the rationalization and interests of the more powerful people. And so this is the normal. I used to say to my petistas and even anti-petistas friends that eventually, I think when PT was in power, for some colleagues on PT, it was kind of a conquest, an accomplishment that was irreversible. And for some colleagues, Tucano colleagues from PSDB or right wing, they were hysterical. You have some kind of pre-ism, a kind of Mexican regime that will last for 70 years. And I always, if you're from the left, you have powerful adversaries by definitions. You can't simply, if you are on the left, if you believe to be on the left, and then you are in power, and you think that all the establishment powers and the established interests are perfectly well with you, perfectly fine with you. So perhaps you're not leftist anymore. So if you still have any ambition of changing things or looking at the ground at the bottom and try to promote them somehow, to think ways of doing this and keeping productivity and growing economy and efficient economy, and at the same time equality and justice and things like that, then you have to expect to have wind on your face and to have some blowback. It won't be easy. It cannot be easy. So it's important to have this, to cultivate this realism on politics without being cynical. The problem with realism that frequently is realists tend to be cynical, and cynical tend to claim that they are the realists. And the challenge is to cultivate realism without surrendering to cynicism. Still to have, if you, it's not to opt between idealism and realism. We have to be realistic, yes. But the problem is that we shouldn't, give up on idealism for that. On the contrary, our purpose as people that think about society is to be successful idealists. To have an idealism that has any perspective of success, you got to be a realist on your diagnosis. So to keep this sobriety, this circumspection, this to try to see things as they are, and then to put a print on it and move things in a desirable way for justice. This is how it works. It's not easy. We just try.
Excellent. Very nice. Okay, just a quick question from Kenneth Gutierrez from the Technological University of Panama. He's asking, what's the ranking of Brazil in democracy?
It's a good question.
Or has it changed?
Yeah, I cannot really say. I don't pay much attention. Occasionally, those rankings may be useful for comparison, may be useful for some studies when you try to correlate some attributes. That you can take several of these rankings and see how you fare, but you have to be cautious in its use and their use, because you know, how to rank democracies and compare. We have to compare. I am a political scientist that would reject the option of just, oh, see, countries are different. They're no better and worse. We can say that in many aspects in social science, the just different society. We're not better or worse than, I don't know, indigenous people that were here before we European descendant came. We're speaking English or Portuguese or Spanish in this country. We are descendants of foreign colonizers. But, and I have no claim to be better or to be building a better society than that. But when we think about politics, yes, we can and have to compare and eventually to rank. I don't know, if we think about Denmark and Syria, we can't just say that Syria works differently from Denmark. Denmark is working unequivocally better than Syria. They're not killing themselves at the same rate. So, but this is a large leap to order a full rank. So I don't pay much attention to those ranks. But Brazil is kind of a interesting thing about Brazilian position in ranks is about corruption. It's not easy to compare corruption in different countries. First, because corruptions will be corruption, different legal system will typify different actions as corrupt or not corrupt. So it's hard to compare. Some acts that were indicted as corruption in Brazil in recent times are not corruption in no place else, to begin with the United States. But so the ranking of perception of corruption captures a lot of cultural traits that are not corruption. So self-esteem is relevant. So the self-perception of corruption in the United States will always be low because they believe sincerely in the value of their constitution, even if they are harsh about their politicians. But in Brazil, or perhaps Italy, I don't know, if you live in a corrupt country, oh, this is completely trashy, you know. Brazil is just the worst place in the world. All politicians are thieves and things like that. But if it's an interest comparison is another ranking about corruption, that is the experience of corruption. Have you ever experienced, have you ever lived through a bribe? And have you, some people offered you something like that? Have you offered something like that? In this kind of ranking, the Brazilian position is pretty low. It's pretty standard. It's pretty average in the world. It's not by far, it's very, very far off the first countries. So it's just to keep some, so that I would say, I've been saying under this, you know, this kind of self-inflictment of purging our sins publicly before the world, that we stage in a kind of institutional harakiri that we practice masochistically before the world. I used to say that no, Brazilian politics is not particularly corrupt. It's just as corrupt as anywhere else. We have our own problems on political financing. But corruption is mainly a transnational problem. It's not a national problem. You know, at this point, we have illicit flows all over the place, tax havens and things like that. All the gross corruption goes far beyond or below our radars. So, and it's a transnational. If we have to curb corruption, we need transnational regulation. We need multilateral regulations that people are not prone to give us. Some countries are very satisfied and just finger and point other people corruption.
And not their own, right? Okay, thank you very much, Marcos. I think you have a very nice question.
It's from Yes The next question is from Adele Simoni, from the University of Bologna in Italy. Is there any chance that the candidacy of Lula in the next elections will improve the chances of Bolsonaro being re-elected?
Mm-hmm.
I think you can also talk, Professor, about a terceira via. If that's a possibility, I think you could, put that all together.
Oh,
that would be nice to hear.
I understand that, yes. Well, thank you, Adele. Again, if the question is there any chance, then the answer is always yes. There is a chance. It's not very likely, I guess. I think that in the last couple of months, the spectrum of Lula candidacy has actually came to weakening, has helped to weaken even more the Bolsonaro chances. Bolsonaro at this point is not a particularly strong contender. He's the president. If he seeks re-election, he's likely to be in the second round. But it's not far-fetched to say that he will not be the favorite over nobody. I think it's a reasonable guess to see that he can lose the election to any other contender that managed to go with him to the second round. But so I think that with Lula showing the figures that he shows now, rehabilitated by Supreme Court, able to campaign for 6 months or so, just as a kind of a survivor of unduly trial, and it's kind of a very strong candidate. Of course, he's a polarizing figure. There are a lot of people that hate Lula, but he's very strong. Perhaps he would have won even 2018 election if he was not arrested. And he's the favorite at this point. Many people that would like to avoid the possibility of Lula being elected would start to think harder about other possibilities. And as Bolsonaro, as president in charge, seeking re-election, would retain some strength that may be sufficient to give him the second round, to lead him to the second round, but not enough to win, then lots of people would like to have him removed from, a lot of people from the right, lots of people that supported him in 2018, as they became skeptical about his chances of beating Lula in the second round, they would like to get rid of him before. So there's in order, you see, I can see much more. You see, Mourão, the vice president, is an inexpressive figure. But if Bolsonaro is removed at this point, and then Mourão takes office, he will stay 1 year as a president. They have an opportunity to just pick himself as a normal president, and then to offer his own name on re-election with a safe place in the second round and better chances than Bolsonaro of doing a good show in the second round. So so lots of people may be thinking about it. At this point, Lula is the favorite. The most likely scenario is a face-to-face match down among Lula and Bolsonaro, where I would bet that Lula is heavy favorite. And so this is the dilemma about many people. But nobody pushed the strings completely. You need a kind of a consultation, a big coordination to remove a president. So it's not trivial. matter.
And what does the hospitalization of Bolsonaro has to do with all that?
What?
You think it's a show?
Oh, I don't know. I just
think it's a
assumed that he
show?
got sick. I had nothing to do with it. You know, it's terrible. The obscene exploration of the pictures in the front page of big media outlets of him with all those plugs. It's just
Why
obscene.
did he do that?
I
It's a
don't know what
show.
happened with media and well, I think I know internet and things like that. Kind of 20, 30 years ago, well, we had 35 years ago a president that died in office, died on the eve of taking office. It was traumatic, horrible. You have no photographs of Tancredo Neves, you know, hospitalized in intense care units.
They have a picture of him dead, right, sitting.
So yes, the quickness of this picture suggests political instrumentalization of the situation, but still, for the records, it's just, for me, as far as I'm concerned, I just assume he is ill.
It's
and
not
needs
going to do
intense
the
care.
same thing as the
That's true.
stabbing did for the election, for example, because people.
This is the point. I just assume he was stabbed because yes, this is in the information. Lots of people doesn't believe that.
But then the stabbing played a role in his election, right? Don't you
Sure,
think?
sure, no doubt about it. No doubt about it.
You don't think that this hospitalization would play any role in his?
Perhaps yes,
Perhaps.
and that's why lots of people doubt about this, the stabbing. If it was real, it was fake. I don't know. I won't mess in this kind of speculation. You know.
Okay.
Perhaps this is the kind of thing that we only know for sure 50 years later.
Yeah, I know. Okay. All right. So we have Isabella from UFG asking, how do you see the military support to Bolsonaro and his government? Do you think that we face a real chance of military intervention again if Bolsonaro loses the election next year, or do you think there's a possibility of happening before that? Are we on the edge of democracy?
Yeah, it's frightening. It's a frightening perspective, right? But this is a very important issue, of course. But I don't see the military as organization, the high command, as willing to stage a coup. This is not the case. I think the Bolsonaro strategy is different. He's not relying on the armed forces, the institutionalized ones, as a kind of, instrument of a military coup for his perpetuation on power. He's bribing them with political posts, with jobs in the administration, so to gain their neutrality in eventual destabilizing movements that he may be tempted to try. What I see as a scenery of destabilization staged by Bolsonaro himself would be a harsh contestation of the legitimacy of the elections, when we will rely not on the army with their tanks seizing power, but with militias and branches, corrupt branches of military police all over the country, indulging in turmoil. You see, this is the point. He cultivates very, very eagerly the loyalty of some, rotten shares of police. He was incentivizing some acts of indiscipline. You see, the police are commanded by state governors, so it's very the relationship between governors and their military police varies considerably across the territory. So you may have turmoil the grassroots level with branches of former policemen, militias, death squads, is far more terrorizing in some respects than a military coup. Military coup at this point, we are not at the Cold War anymore. So when the Cold War were indispensable, a necessary ingredient for the success of all those coups in Latin America in the 60s. You know, we're not in the Cold War anymore. And eventually you see a tank parade in Brasilia would mean very little at this point, you know, how you seize power on in current conditions, actually. So it's not trivial, and it will be surely short-lived. But you know, Bolsonaro is betting in a more insidious approach, that is just to seed in acts of insubordination and rebellion in grassroots level, at local level, with militias and policemen and retired policemen and corrupt policemen, trying to. It wouldn't be enough for him to seize power in the case he lose election, but he may, you know, he may stage a big mess. And so you should look for the Trump case again. You see how it was never, he never had all that uprising on the Capitol, never had the realistic perspective of success, but he can make a mess. And he can just seed turmoil and doubtness, and to erode the trust of the political trust of population in institutions. This is the point. And you see, in America, in the United States, you have a long-lived multi-secular adherence of population to the values of founding fathers, all this semi-religious and sacrosanct approach and reception that Americans give to founding fathers and their constitution and things, the beacon of liberty, home of the brave, land of opportunities, and all that mythology. This is relevant. This is politically very relevant. Brazil is an extreme case of a cynical approach to political institutions. So the same Trumpian strategy of just making noise and spreading confusion may be very traumatic and have more lasting implications in Brazilian case. I don't believe he will be able to succeed, to go over the fence and just stay in power based on that, but it may seed confusion for decades. So.
I know. Thank you very much. Professor Marcos, I think you have a good question.
Thank you. So we have another question from Juliana Oliveira from UC Davis. And her question is, how much has prior American intervention impacted the strength of Brazil's political system?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a sad question. It's an important and sad one. I used to be, for most of my life, skeptical about this. Until recently, I would give a skeptical response. By the impeachment, during the dictatorship, during transition, during Lula's term, even during Dilma impeachment, it was pretty much reasonably clear that the United States, behind the scenes, would encourage, how to speak, unconstructive behavior from some political elites that had destabilizing effects. They gave backing to the military coup in '64, and well, in recent years became clear that they were encouraging an indispensable piece also of the Lava Jato operation. And this is very sad, and I'm trying to think a bit more systematically about it with some pessimistic conclusions. I used to say that, you know, I used to dismiss this in some grounds that, you know, a kind of a power geopolitics is just a power geopolitics. big power. They have their own priorities, and we have to do our homework to somehow cope with it. This is what I used to say when Dilma Rousseff was being overthrown. Okay, the US may have helped them to get the result, but our problem is just to face it and eventually to prevail and to take realistically this in count and see how to do. But I'm wondering if this is realistic, if it is really possible to face it. I stayed in Penn, University of Pennsylvania, for 2014-2015 academic year, just a visiting scholar. And there I learned a joke by an Argentinian scholar that is eradicated and at Penn, Emilio Parrado. It's a good friend. It's a wonderful joke. A great difference between democracy in the United States and democracy all over the rest of the globe, and especially Latin America, is that at the US, you don't have an American embassy. Because the other countries have an American embassy, and so they have a problem. Because the American embassy used to be unconstructive and destabilizing force. They used to encourage illegal conduct. They used to encourage just, you know, and I start to think if it is realistic to expect anything different from that. Perhaps in the case of Latin America, with just too weak and too close to a country that's just too strong, in order for us to be able to have a kind of a stable orbit, that it's not impacted by the gravitational force of this huge planet that is just around. You see, so I think part of the explanation of the chronic instability of Latin American politics is the closeness to the United States. And still, we are not their priority in geopolitical and in strategic terms. They are oriented for the North Atlantic and for Pacific. Latin America is just a region that happens to be close. And it's not, and this somehow, perhaps it gives way to a kind of impatient way of dealing with Latin America. If you have some problem there, just get rid of it. And it's easy for them to do this because there are lots of people, powerful people locally in these countries that's just eager to do a favor to American friends. So this is enormously destabilizing, and perhaps there's no way out of it. I don't know. You see, only with some kind of multilateral institutional arrangement, but cannot be on their terms, of course. But if it's not on their terms, they will not be interested. So I don't see an easy way out of it. And it's kind of a predicament that we have to live with and to think harder on it. It's not just a kind of, oh, they should be nice. It's on their interest. Barack Obama had a very beautiful phrase on the campaign in 2008 that gave me hope as sometimes. Hope, Obama and hope. Always the same thing. But he said in a speech campaign in Florida, a very important phrase that was forgotten, even by him probably, that what's good for Latin American people is good for the US. And that's true. That's a deep truth. But, you know, the US have more to do. They have no time or patience to think about what's good for Latin American people. They're just solving their problems as fast as possible when Latin America is concerned. Because the point is, because this is a paraphrasis of some phrase here that local conservative elites used to say in Latin America. What's good to America is good for Brazil. What's good for the United States, good for Argentina. Local elites always say that, you know, cajoling the sympathy of American friends. Barack Obama very aptly inverted it. What's good for Latin American people is good for the US. This is true. If Latin America is a more prosperous and more stable, more just region, all America will thrive, all America will benefit. And the geopolitical position of the United States will strengthen in due turn, in due time. But at first, in the first moment, when Latin American countries start to organize and to try to bargain position with a harder stance against the immediate American interests, they just shake the table. They just give up. They walk away of negotiations and they turn to sabotage. It's cheaper, it's faster, it's more effective for immediate purpose. And then United States see itself eternally isolated in the hemisphere as a lone power country. And China is in this point very grateful in taking advantage of perhaps in due term, stronger geopolitical connection with its surroundings.
Thank you very much. And then following that, which has something to do with it, Cecilia from the University of Puerto Rico, she's asking, how did Trump's win in the US affect the elections in Brazil? So I think you could work a little bit more on this impact. I think we can also talk about the campaign and how they use social media and how they, reach the same marketing people that Trump did, and maybe you can work a little bit on that.
Yeah, okay. Well, I don't think a causal next, as you see, about a connection about, well, Trump won in 2016, so Bolsonaro won in Brazil because of some Trump act. I don't see things this way. Yes, I think they are both symptoms of the same process. They have very similar characteristics, and they were made possible by some shared traits of both environments. They are made possible by technology, sure, not only, but yes, also by technology. And yes, Bolsonaro used the same playbook. It's very clear, very clear. And so perhaps the Trump's success gave a clear strategy, provided a clear strategy for Bolsonarians, so to speak. I don't see Bolsonaro as a mastermind of anything. You see, he's very unfit for office. Surely, very, very, very clearly inept. But yes, the playbook is very recognizable. The strategies are the same. All those fake news things. It's not the aim there is very clear at this point. It's not just to spread some false information. It's just to spread confusion. I used to call it political earth. How to say terraplanismo in English? Just the flat earthism, political flat earthism. And just the theory of the flat earth is just an epitome of this. Nothing is sufficiently absurd that you cannot sustain in public for a long time under the current environment. So the thesis of the flat earth is just a symbol for all the strategy. You're just saying some sensible, well-informed things about good data and things like that. Well, I will say the opposite. And I'll bet that you can't just show publicly that I am wrong. And so the strategy is just to spread confusion. And as you spread confusion successfully, you really get a hard hit on democracy. Democracy was never just a rational debate, of course. It was power, it was bargaining. But its justification relies on the possibility of we all having a rational debate despite our different views. And if you just empty all this in a cloud of confusion, and you just press play for, say, half a century, 50 years, you will barely recognize democracy at the other point, the other side. So it's a very corrosive strategy, and we still have to see effective ways to cope with it.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor. This next question, I believe you already answered partially before, but I will ask this question anyway, just to see if you have something more to add to it. The question is from Albrecht Flakowski from Freie Universität Berlin in Germany, and he's saying, somehow the Dilma chapter is not clear to me. From what you said, I hear that you were not surprised that she got impeached. That somehow you can even understand, because she reacted too slow on economic developments, for example. But is that a reason to impeach her? I mean, if the reason was not that she was criminal, but rather her political conduct, why then did she get impeached and Bolsonaro did not yet?
Yeah, I thank you so much for your question, Albert, to make things more clear. It was not reason for impeachment. It was it's legitimate to depict the Rousseff's impeachment as a coup. It's legitimate. This is a kind of a terminology and definitional stake that will always quarrel indefinitely about it. But yes, people just saw, some powerful enemies just saw the opportunity and seized it. This is the thing. And yes, I was surprised. A different thing is try to understand what went on in a way that we can avoid to allow this to happen again and things like that. I was surprised. I wasn't expecting. I was not a sympathizer. Yes, I am a sympathizer, a Lula sympathizer. I was appalled by the choosing of Dilma as successor. Come on, she never ran for office. You see, some kind of, she may be the best minister in the world. It's not the same thing of being the head of government. It's the different, different skill demand. The demanding are on different skills here. It's not her. And yet, but okay, people will probably know what they're doing. I just normalized it. But yes, she was not a good president. And I think that if you're on the left, what I was saying, you have to have a very deep-grounded realism to see the forces of your enemies. I see some kind of conservatism in Lula economic policy approach was grounded in some kind of prudence that is apt in this case. Lula knew that one thing could not happen to him. He could not allow being overthrown. Mantenere lo Stato, as Machiavelli would put it. You have to be able to survive, first of all, and then to implement. And so he's conservative. Of course, China helped a lot, but not only. He had a very apt economic policy. And I think his conservatism, his good ties with IMF, his good ties with G20, his good embedment globally was important to give him space, oxygen, political oxygen, to implement their priorities, Bolsa Familia, and to channel funds and rent to people on the bottom of the pyramid. For that, he channeled to the top. Middle class was paying the bill, grossly. Middle class, you know, middle class sociologically is not middle class statistically. So it was at the top of the pyramid. We were paying a lot. The people that are far above the pyramid, they were gaining too. So those are the veto players usually. So this kind of, but he was very orthodox in economic policy. So not to get space for critics to come to the point of being willingly to overthrow him. But things changed. Yes, commodities were not so well priced. You know, industry did not fare well under Lula either, and not under Fernando Henrique. Industry only thrived in Brazil under inflation, with currency under evaluation, that you have a exchange subsidy and then you have industrialization under the military dictatorship with high inflation, that the poor people were paying the price of this industrialization. And then with democratization, with the Real plan from Fernando Henrique on, then inflation became the priority because it was a democracy again. So if you curb inflation, we won the election. And so during Sarney, Collor, Itamar, Franco, we spoke of little else beyond inflation. And then Fernando Henrique got the ticket and was elected and re-elected, because this is crucial. But as soon as we curb inflation and we don't have any more the subsidy by the exchange rate, for industry began to suffer. And so we never really made our homework to figure out how to cope with that. Neither Fernando Henrique, neither Lula, nor Dilma. But Dilma took bold steps and accepted risks in economic policy that Lula wouldn't. And it was not just that, because afterwards, in retrospect, that I realized how deeply isolated she allowed herself to be. It's a bad position to be. He had alienated in her first term, even PT and unions and civil society. It had not a good relationship and a good conversation with those actors. At the dramatic moment, they rallied around her again, but they were not close to her in the beginning. So she was apart, she was isolated from Congress and from the judicial branch and from military. Lula were in close connection with all those guys. So, bad steps. That would be ground for impeachment? Of course not. It was just an opportunity. This is the point. It's not, there are not grounds for impeachment. There was just a fabrication. It's clear. It's just how we get rid of her. Well, there are lots of corruption going on. You can always find something. They didn't. As well as you won't find a proof of personal corruption by Lula. Moro went after his money, all over the globe and found nothing. So the problem was not corruption of political elite in itself. The problem was that people knew how to manage overpriced contracts from state-owned enterprise in order to have donations for electoral campaigns afterwards. This is a business model all over the world. And the scale of it may vary from place to place, dependent on the regulations put in place. But it's standard procedure. You know, in France, we had in the 90s the ELF Aquitaine scandal that was pretty much identical to Petrolão and Petrobras. The difference is that the contract with the government of African country, former colonial African country, and not with French government itself. But it drained money to French campaigns. So it's pretty much the same. But the problem is you just cannot afford the destabilization of the political process for that. And that's precisely what we said, in part because people went after Dilma, saw an opportunity, and so they fostered this kind of predatorial inquirement, and they legalized it. They accepted all kind of excesses for a good time. Then all of a sudden who was elected was not kind of a standard oppositional figure like Geraldo Alckmin from PSDB, but was Bolsonaro. It wasn't in the radar. It wasn't to be like that. And then all the ambience for Lava Jato shifted rapidly. And then Lula was released and the cases were dismissed and the atmosphere changed. But now, because lots of people that were eager to get rid of PT discovered themselves embraced to Bolsonaro. It was not the plan initially. So, and then it spread confusion. And at this point, we are just, that huge hangover of a bad night, lots of regrets about what we shouldn't have done, but you still have to face the morning.
Yeah, I know. Professor, following that question, I still have doubts about this anti-PT, anti-workers party thing, because I know what happened to the country when Lula was the president. I know Bolsa Família helped people. I mean, I'm middle class, so I was not directly benefited by any of the programs, but I could see what it did to the university, for example, what it did to the poor people. But I also saw what it did to the billionaires, with to the billionaires, like Pendes. So Lula was able to, at a very high cost, of course, was able to please both the very poor or the poor and the billionaires. So does this anti-PT and this communist threat, where does it come from? Does it come from the middle class? Because, I mean, if you were to think that Lula pleased everyone, wouldn't that be nice for the millionaires and billionaires as well? And weren't the poor benefited, so they have familia, their lives became better? We see the difference. I mean, we visually see the difference at the university, for example, how the university changed, UFMG changed so much without I mean, where did this come from? And where this communist threat, where are they taking that from?
Well, this is anti-communist ghost is a part of a kind of a playbook since mid-20th century. It was not real. It was very rarely realistic. And it was not realistic at all in '64. But it's always possible to just throw thrones of people at the streets with Bibles and crucifixes and claiming to God to save us all from communism and things like that. There are good money interested in spreading this. But still, we have to be cautious and kind of a narrative we indulge ourselves in trying to be synthetic. This is a huge mess, and a point that we have to stress, and we'll never stress enough, that nobody pulled the strings completely. So this is kind of, well, at some point, there's a big convergence of powerful people on the opportunity to get rid of Dilma Rousseff. There's not necessarily completely anti-Petistas. They're not necessarily, they could be very good terms with PT government until 6 months before, but at some point, people accomplished a convergence. And, okay, let's do it. Okay, let's support it. Let's go on. This is pretty much chaotic and hard to anticipate. We more frequently try to reconstruct afterwards what took place in order to get some clue or how it works. But in the case of Brazil, of Lula's Brazil, billionaires in a certain sense is something I used to say is not the top of the pyramid, it's far above the pyramid. So it's statistical. So that's why taxes over big fortunes, they are not very efficient because the few people that you just have to tax, and you have to have scale on that. So, and what the pyramid is concerned, what we used to call middle classes, all of us, we are the top of the pyramid. Okay, we with my salary of university professor, I am the 2 or 3% richer in the country. So it's you have a very large basis of the pyramid, and then the top is very thin. And so Lula was effective and politically and electorally effective with little effort to start to ground. People from unions used to say the connection. He's grounded. He knew where he had to channel resources. This is the point. And otherwise, how I see him is just, what's the price I have to pay? Okay. He's just channeling resources to his constituency. It was not his constituency at first. It became his constituency for the results of his first term on the Northeast. He lost in the Northeast in 2002. He lost in Lagoas, and he won in the cities and lost in the hinterland in 2002. And in 2006, he swept up the Northeast. So this was policy effect. And he was willing to pay the price. He was willing to accommodate to status quo in order to, this is ironic, it's not a socialist utopia. Lula's utopia is not socialism. Lula's utopia is petit bourgeois, it's consumption for the masses. You see, a lot of hardline leftist friends hate Lula because he's the biggest legitimizer Brazilian capitalism could have expected for, because it just bets on consumption for the people. But that's the point. You see, take capitalism for granted, and he probably lacked vision about long-term processes, about how we had to reframe Brazilian capitalism, even in the interest of Brazilian capitalism itself in the long term. This is a problem that plagued governments all over the world, inconsistency of time lagging preferences. You have to win the next election, and you have to channel resources to the basis of the pyramid, and how the easiest way to do that. Let's do it. You see, so this is Lula. This is how his mindset. So middle class for him, it was just, the people that unfortunately had to pay the price. That's so bad. So I think there are some missed opportunities. Yes, about income taxes, about how to distribute. So what's the big flaw of PT terms in my understanding? A kind of fiscal negationism, denialism, you see? A fiscal denialism, as well as Bolsonaro has a much more urgent and serious pandemic denialism. PT has kind of a fiscal denialism, because you see the fiscal question, they allow the fiscal question and the tax issue to be a monopoly, be monopolized by their adversaries. We have space for let's call it like that, a leftist tax reform in Brazil. It wouldn't be easy. It's not a prudent thing to take office and just do it. But given the huge success of Lula in 2 terms, the 3 terms, successful terms that PT had, it's a pity that they weren't able even to put the question, put the issue. Because we have a lot of distortions in taxation in Brazil is very regressive, and remained regressive under PT. And this is a pity. And it's unforgivable that at the moment of the collapse, the country was in bad shape, bad fiscal shape. So this is just a paradise for a right-wing narrative. Oh, you see, those leftists, they used to spend a lot, far more than all those benefits that Lula granted. We never were able to sustain that. It's simply not true. But, you know, under the Dilma's term, the fiscal situation that was deteriorated, yes, unfortunately. And at this point, you have all the hill to climb again. So,
Professor, I am so very much sorry it's 11 a.m. And unfortunately, we have approached the end of our talk. It was
yeah.
such
Oh no, I
an
see you have still 25 new messages here.
Right? See, unfortunately, right? And then we had such a delightful time. I mean, it's unfortunate news, but it were wonderful words and a great lecture. I am very sure we learned so much. It's always such an honor to have you with us in our summer school President studies. It's such a great pleasure to hear you speak. I could stay here like for the rest of the day. And on behalf of the Office of International Affairs, I would like to thank you. And also our Deputy Dean for International Affairs, Professor Dabson Lopes, and our coordinator of the Summer School Visiting Studies, Professor Lucas Lima. I would like to convey their gratitude to you. And hopefully we will have you next year, and this time face to face, right? So we can like
okay, let's hope.
Hopefully have coffee together and see each other and be together. And so once again, thank you very much. And if you have some final words.
No, I just want to thank you all. It's such a great pleasure. You know, it's always a bit thrilling at the eve, no matter how many times you do this. As it's approaching, it's, oh no, I have this English class again next week, and so. But then when you're here, so it's
when you started out, right?
to be here and to listen to
Great. Thank you very, very much, Professor. And
Thank
then
you.
in a few minutes, we are going to have the Portuguese classes, guys. So get ready and do not forget Professor Nicolelis at 2 p.m. I'll be waiting for you. Okay? Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you, Marcos.